I feel like with Nosferatu, Robert Eggers is getting cozy with other contemporary auteurs like Christopher Nolan and Denis Villeneuve, the directors that have broad appeal among movie enthusiasts. They're good craftsmen. They make well-made, well-produced, well-shot films that I think are appealing, particularly visually, to a large audience. But they lack like a distinctive personality. And I think it was Eggers' intention to make Nosferatu more commercial, relatively speaking. I prefer his wackier movies like The Lighthouse, for example. But perhaps it's the best course of action to get this story made. It's something he's been wanting to do for a long time. It's not to say this is like a super duper family friendly commercial venture here. We see the murder of children, for example. But I think within the horror landscape, this film doesn't really stand apart from that. It feels like what you would expect from a big horror film these days. The gothic imagery, the scares, the blood, all that just feels very much expected from the contemporary horror genre. So much so that it felt like a bit of a slog to get through. And also because the characters didn't engross me enough. Even someone like William Dafoe, who's always great, didn't really bring much to his role here. That's not to say that Eggers didn't bring some freshness to the story. He did set out to focus more on Ellen's point of view as the main character of the story, but I don't think he was quite successful with that, because I do feel like the plot meandered between a lot of different characters. I think it's probably spent too much time on Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, and it was Willem Dafoe's character that really drove the plot forward a lot of time. But the idea that Ellen's character, played by Lily Rose Depp here, was the motivational factor for Nosferatu, for him to come to the village, I think that was a good choice narratively. That made sense. She was like this almost like divine symbol of innocence and corruption, I guess. She did have an evil sense in her that she was ashamed of. That is a central theme of it, right? Which I think Eggers did play with, the shame that Ellen had for having these sexual desires, and Nosferatu representing that shadow in her, that evil in her. But it still stayed to the same storyline, the same plot beats of the original Murnau, as well as the Herzog movie, as well as, in general, a lot of these Dracula movies, in which the female lead embodies the Madonna horror contradictions and ends up being like a sacrifice. You can see as a bit empowering because she is the one that is being, oppressed by by the patriarchal system and the men in her life that don't really pay much attention to her, with the exception of Willem Dafoe's character, though she's put on this platform to be a sacrificial figure as a savior for the town. So, her fate is still very much death, even though, she may be seen as a martyr. The story hasn't been updated to give her more agency beyond her sacrifice. At the end of the day, she's still punished for her sexual desire. There was a bit of a missed opportunity there to update that story from what we've seen in the past, now that we're 100 years since the original silent film. But, there's different changes to it, like Nosferatu feeding on his victims through the chest, accessing the heart, I imagine, more easily versus the neck. Of course, the design of the vampire is very different. It's more corpse-like, it's more monstrous. It does make him more of a symbol than an actual character. And perhaps that makes sense for the kind of story he wanted to tell, but it also kind of just simplifies the story, and it feels like a bit of a regression from what Herzog did with his remake in the 79. And in just general, the performances just felt like a little bland, and maybe a lot of the acting in this film may have to do with the fact, again, that Eggers, I feel like, didn't really let his actors breathe in the scenes. I think Eggers was more interested in achieving an overall gothic horror look that looks great in isolated shots. Put all together in a film, it almost feels like a compilation from a gothic horror fan on the internet, you know? Nice to look at, but doesn't offer much more beyond that. But at the same time, it was like heavy on the plot of it all. And so that again detracted from the development of the characters. Nosferatu, of course, was a monster. He didn't have much presence besides being a scary monster in the shadows. I just kept getting pulled out from the world. And although Eggers wanted to give Ellen more of a presence, I feel like, and she kind of got lost in the tableau of this horror movie. You know, in the key moments that did focus on her, that stood out, did feel a little forced. Like the moment that she's possessed and going through these convulsions, it didn't feel authentic to me. And it was in reference to other scenes that feature possession. I was immediately thinking of Isabelle Adjani's iconic moment from the movie Possession. And, you know, maybe it's unfair to compare it to something as extreme as this scene. But I think if Eggers had given Depp a little bit more space to work with, actually center on her character, build up to the moment where she's doing these convulsions, it could have, you know, played out better, maybe even closer to something like this. And by the way, Isabelle also played Ellen in the Herzog version of Nosferatu, which we'll get to. If you really want to see, I think, a horror movie that actually focuses on the female perspective that came out this year, I would say The First Omen goes much harder than Nosferatu. And not just the possession horror scenes, but also just thematically. Of course, Eggers still has some striking visuals. It isn't an entirely vapid moment in the theaters or at home, and eventually when you can watch it at home. It was just too mired in the iconography of Nosferatu that it kind of loses a bit of its soul, you know. For me, it wasn't really frightening because I couldn't really get immersed in the world enough to really believe the characters. I guess also just a matter of preference. I think there's a lot of people who like Eggers' style here and very much can be enveloped in this world. You know, I guess like the Dracula story has been around for so long, I just want to see something that stands out more. You know, looking at something like Coppola's Dracula, which is an actual adaptation of the Dracula story by Bram Stoker, that had a lot of personality to it. It's maybe more of a popcorn, entertaining version of the Dracula story. And it has that sensibility from the 90s. It has that eroticism from the 90s. But it's a take on the story that I feel like is a lot more fun to rewatch, you know, versus Eggers' Nosferatu, which just feels dreary and more visually oppressive to the point that it's kind of just dull, you know, in my opinion. But then we can compare it to Werner Herzog's Nosferatu from 1979. It's definitely more of a slower pace, but it feels more painterly. Another thing I like about this one is that it feels more connected to nature, you know, as well as perhaps the societal impact of Nosferatu in his vampirism. Unlike Eggers' version, which is maybe more focused on the psychosexual nature of Ellen's trauma and, you know, and the individual impact he has. This one, I think, like the Murnau film, also focuses more on the plague aspect, the idea of Nosferatu bringing a plague to this town. You know, in both films, the depiction of the Romani people is lacking. Obviously, the 1979 version is a bit dated, but it at least gives the Romani people a little bit more character and more presence. While in Eggers' version, they're just kind of like dancing in the background in a scene. But besides the deferring visuals, which I think it's maybe more up to your preference, whether you like a more pastoral, poetic look of Herzog's versus the more gloomy aesthetic of Eggers. What stands out most between the two is the performances. You know, Herzog lets the actors breathe and really gives them the stage to really live in the role, and give their characters more of a personality. Not so much like archetypes in a horror movie, but this Nosferatu is very much about his existential melancholy, So this is Klaus Kinski as Nosferatu. He was known as a very strong, tyrannical personality on set, not really good to work with. There's actually a documentary about his relationship with Herzog and how difficult it was to work with him. After his death, he was accused of abusing his daughter. He's not a great guy, but we can at least find some solace in the fact that he is playing himself in this movie. a monstrous figure who gets his comeuppance at the end. But if we do focus on his performance, he is very much more humanized in this version of Nosferatu. He's very much like a lonely figure, who yearns for some companionship, some love, and sees his eternal life as a curse rather than, a great power. It's this scene in particular, if you compare this scene with the Eggers version, it's this scene in particular that showcases the difference and why I feel like this Nosferatu is a much more effective and even scarier villain than in Eggers' movie. In the Eggers movie, Nosferatu is like a monster in the shadows. He feels very much otherworldly, while here he feels like an actual person that more accurately represents what you might encounter in the real world. And it's this moment here that really freaks me out more, because it just reminds me of an actual violent person. The way he slams that chair there as he approaches Jonathan Harker. It's also important to note that they filmed two versions of this movie back to back, an English version and a German version. So you can actually see slight variations between each version. Herzog said that the German version is more authentic, but he still thinks the English version is great. For the most part, you can only really tell the differences if you look at them back to back. Now, I haven't compared each version closely, back to back, but I have gone through some of the scenes, and I think I do prefer the English version, because it feels like the German version, sometimes some of the takes were like a rehearsal almost, and then, by the time they did the English version of that scene, they had a better grasp of what they were doing, both the performers and the camera work even. Like this moment here where he pushes the chair aside is a lot more forceful in the English version, I think. So this is the German version right here. That's how he does it in the German version. And then here again is the English version. And then he's even more in shadow in the English version. I think it just plays out a little better in this version. And also the sound design has more impact in the English version. Here it is again. And here's the German version. See the difference there? And there's some other examples we'll go through actually. This is the English version of him entering here. Versus the German version here. Which I think it takes a little bit too long to pan up. So there's a moment where she shows her cross necklace to get rid of Nosferatu. And in the English version, I think it's edited better. It stays in the close-up during her dialogue, and then as she reveals the cross. Versus in the German version, which is a wider shot, and then cuts the close-up more abruptly. This scene ends, with her telling him good night. She's a bit taken aback, but it plays off a little differently in the German version, where she puts her hands on her face. Maybe this version showcases more of her vulnerability. So maybe from one perspective this might be better. As Herzog said, this was more an authentic version. We get to see maybe more of what she's feeling inside. versus the previous version where we don't see her really break down. But for the most part, both versions are very similar. Again, they're just like slight variations. Like looking at them back to back, it's kind of like you're in the editing room looking at different takes of a scene. Both have their pros and cons. But I do think that the Herzog version actually gives Ellen's character more of a presence than Eggers' version, especially in the last part of the movie. Like, we have a scene here, like this scene again, we see, how the plague is affecting the townsfolk as well. We have a scene here with Ellen, joining in this Last Supper situation with these people who are almost willfully ignoring the upcoming plague here. And there's other moments where she's going about the town, telling people like she knows that this, she knows the source of the curse, it's Nosferatu, but no one will believe her. Another key moment is the final sequence in which she lures Nosferatu to her bedside to drink from her, and thus, keeping him drinking until the sun comes out, so she can, sacrifice herself for the sake of the town. This scene in the Eggers movie kind of goes by too fast, while in the Herzog movie, he lingers on it for much longer. It feels like Nosferatu is actually taking his time and savoring this moment. Both movies have the moment here where she brings him back to her, to make sure he keeps on drinking. But again, this feels more prolonged and creepier. It feels more real and disturbing to me than the monster we see in Eggers' version. It even takes a while for him to realize that the sun has come up. It felt more believable in this version that he was actually so intoxicated by the blood sucking that he lost track of time, versus an Eggers' version felt more contrived and happened too quickly. I guess we get a cool shot in Eggers' version of Nosferatu, eyes bleeding out as the sun hits his face. But I think I prefer this shot of Nosferatu curled up in a ball in the corner there. Now, I was kind of hoping that Eggers' version would actually change up the ending a bit, do something a little different. The conclusion of Ellen's character to sacrifice herself could have been updated. They could have maybe even gone more kinkier, have some kind of sub-dom exchange beforehand, convincing Nosferatu to savor the blood, the pleasure of withholding, maybe even have an existential conversation or something into the night, long enough for Nosferatu to forget that time was passing and that the sun was coming up. In this version, Jonathan here becomes a vampire. Van Helsing gets arrested even though there's no cops around. This is a funny scene. Like, this guy's like, arrest him, and the other guy's like, but there's no cops left. There's, no one guarding the prisons or the jail or anything because everyone's dead. And he's like, well, you're just gonna do it yourself. Again, kind of like going back to societal effects of the plague, of the vampirisms, not just centered on a small group of people like in Eggers' film. Herzog, I think, is more concerned with the greater impact that Nosferatu has. Perhaps jailing Van Helsing here isn't the best course of action at this moment, or ever. Maybe the police have always been useless. So he becomes a vampire. That was like a twist here that Herzog added. What if instead Ellen became the vampire? And she took the power from Nosferatu, literally. Perhaps that would have been more of an empowering feminist take, perhaps. I don't know. But that's an example. I feel like Eggers just could have done much more with the material, but it seems like he chose to be more safe with it, and in that way, it just was not as interesting to me in comparison to Herzog's version or some of the other Dracula adaptations we've seen over the years. By the way, here's another difference between the German and English version of Nosferatu the Vampire by Werner Herzog. He has a glazed over look here, but it feels like he has a lot on his mind, and it feels a little more natural in this English version. And then he ends with this smile and looks down a bit, you know, as he contemplates his future. In the German version, he's a little more dead-eyed, and when he smiles, he just keeps looking forward before it cuts. You know, this version comes across a little bit more menacing, more monstrous, more like innately evil. Well, in this one, it feels like a bit more uncertain and perhaps more maybe mentally unstable, but there's still some light in him. I don't know. What do you think? But yeah, that's Nosferatu, Eggers versus Herzog. Of course, the original is the classic one. It's a bit unfair to compare this one with the newer ones because it is a silent film. It's like over 100 years old now. But the imagery, of course, is everlasting and iconic. If you don't have the patience for a silent film, it's probably worth it to at least have it on in the background while you're maybe doing some housework or something, just to catch some of the images here and there. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are about the new Nosferatu by Eggers. Have you seen Herzog's version? Are you interested in watching the older versions? There's a movie called Shadow of the Vampire that stars William Dafoe as Nosferatu, and it's about like the making of the original film. You know, so it's more of a meta take on the Nosferatu story. I have not watched that one. I remember actually seeing clips of it when I was younger, and for a long time the images of that were in my head. I thought that was a Herzog movie for a long time, and I was like, oh yeah, I've seen clips of that, but it was actually from that movie. And I do plan to see that at some point, maybe soon. And I also didn't mean to sound too harsh on Eggers here, you know, like I'm sure everyone on the film worked really hard on it. They've been getting a lot of praise from a lot of people, so I don't think they're hurting too much about it. And you know, again, it's just a matter of opinion. Anyways, that's gonna do it for now. I will see you next time under the moonlight, not that sunlight, because you know what happens when that sunlight comes out. I'll be here in the dark. I'll see you next time. Sleep tight. Bye bye.